My name is Dorothy Roberts, and I'm the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander Professor of Civil Rights, and Professor of Africana Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. On behalf of the Center for Africana Studies, welcome to the 2020 Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Memorial Lecture. This annual lecture, which honors the legacy of Judge Higginbotham, is co-hosted by the Center for Africana Studies and Penn Carey School of Law. We're grateful to Dean Ted Ruger, Dean of Penn Law, for his generous partnership in hosting this lecture. And we're absolutely delighted that Dr. Eddie S Glaude Jr. will present this year's Higginbotham Lecture. The Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Lecture was instituted in 1989 by Penn's then Afro-American Studies program in honor of Judge Higginbotham and his contributions to the American legal and scholarly communities and to the University of Pennsylvania. The lecture was renamed the Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Memorial Lecture in 1999 after Judge Higginbotham's death in 1998. Past Higginbotham lecturers have included Patricia Williams, Charles Ogletree, Nigerian human rights lawyer Hawa Ibrahim, Haitian human rights lawyer Mario Joseph, Brian Stevenson, Mary Frances Berry, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, Sherilyn Eiffel, and last year's lecturer Brittany Barnett. We always take a few moments during this program to honor the memory of Judge A. Leon Higginbotham and to highlight a few of his numerous accomplishments and contributions. Higginbotham began his legal career as a law clerk in the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas in Pennsylvania. In 1953, he was appointed as an assistant district attorney in Philadelphia, and in 1954, he became a founding partner of the first African-American law firm in Philadelphia, Norris, Schmidt, Green, Harris, and Higginbotham. Higginbotham left private practice to serve in government and public service positions, including Special Deputy Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1956, Commissioner of the Pennsylvania Human Rights Commission in 1961, and president of the Philadelphia chapter of the NAACP from 1960 to 1962. President Kennedy appointed Higginbotham to the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania in 1964, and he was confirmed in 1964 as one of the youngest judges ever appointed to a federal bench. He played an important role in the civil rights movement as an advisor to President Johnson after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1977, President Carter appointed him to the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, where he later served as chief judge and senior judge from 1991 until his retirement in 1993. He joined the faculty at the Harvard University School, Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government as public service jurisprudence professor after retiring from the bench. Higginbotham was also a historian and a prolific writer and produced several critically acclaimed books, including In the Matter of Color, The Colonial Period, published in 1978, and Shades of Freedom, Racial Politics and Presumptions in the American Legal Process in 1996. The recipient of numerous local, regional, and national honors, Judge Higginbotham was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1995 by President Clinton. At the University of Pennsylvania, he served as a board member of the Board of Overseers for the Law School, chairman of the Board of Overseers of the Law School and the Graduate School of Education, adjunct professor in the law school, and as a university trustee from 1968 until his death in 1998. In recognition of his, quote, generous service to others, his judicious compassion, and his warm understanding of man's strengths and foibles, close quote, the Board of Trustees conferred upon him the the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws in May 1975. So you see why this is such a special lecture honoring this remarkable jurist and scholar. Now it's my honor to introduce another remarkable scholar, this evening's speaker, Dr. Eddie S Glaude, Jr. Dr. Glaude is the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. His most well-known books, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, take a wide look at Black communities, the long legacy of race and racism in the United States, and the challenges our democracy faces. Glaude's most recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, was released in June 2020 and became an instant bestseller. He's also the author of 3 books on religion and philosophy, including Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation in Early 19th Century Black America, which was awarded the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Book Prize. And Glaude is also the author of 2 edited volumes and many influential articles about religion for academic journals. He's also written for the New York Times, is a columnist for Time Magazine, and is a frequent MSNBC contributor on programs like Morning Joe and Deadline White House with Nicole Wallace. And I know I've caught him on the Trevor Noah show, and I love to see his books on the shelf behind Trevor Noah now that the show is remote. Known to be a convener of conversations and debates, Glaude takes care to engage fellow citizens of all ages and backgrounds, from young activists to fellow academics, journalists, and commentators, and followers on Twitter in dialogue about the direction of the nation. His scholarship and his sense of himself as a public intellectual are driven by a commitment to think carefully with others in public. The title of Dr. Glaude's lecture this evening is The Magician's Serpent, Race and the Tragedy of American Democracy. Now, before I turn this over to Dr. Glaude, let me just give a few instructions about how we'll proceed. Following Dr. Glaude's lecture, we'll have time for him to answer questions from the audience. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat box at any time during the lecture. Now I will turn the podium over to our distinguished lecturer. Welcome, Dr. Glaude.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. I'm so honored to speak here. The A. Leon Higginbotham Lecture. I'm deeply honored by your introduction. I have been so shaped by the wisdom of your scholarship and the prophetic nature of your witness. And so I just want to lift you up and thank you for that gracious introduction. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
I want to thank the administration, the African American Studies, the law school, and all the folks who've made this possible behind the scenes. Even though we're in the virtual world, it still takes folk to make this kind of stuff happen. So I'm just thankful for all of you, and I'm glad that you're safe and that you're healthy. I want to jump right into my talk, and hopefully will do justice to how much Judge Higginbotham means to me. I find myself these days, more so than usual, reaching for books. Any book, really. Fiction, nonfiction, poetry. Anything to distract from the ongoing spectacle that is this country's politics, or anything to help me understand more fully this mess. And I mean mess in the Beckett sense of the word. Of course, there's the work, teaching remotely, of course, Zoom, tarrying with the words and life of James Baldwin. And when I'm not doing that, I'm navigating the currents of Trumpism and its afterlife, talking incessantly and coping with, because I cannot seem to do anything else, the sourness that sits at the bottom of my stomach. and that every now and again creeps up to the back of my throat, bitter, sour. With all of this, I want to hear a voice other than my own. So I read. Ironic. My spirit is all the better, but my eyes, not so much. I've been reading a lot about democracy and its exemplary figures in the United States, from Ralph Waldo Emerson to James Baldwin, from Jane Addams to Lorraine Hansberry. This has been my effort to find resources within what can be crudely called the American democratic tradition to respond to the contemporary distortions of American life. David Blight's wonderful biography of Frederick Douglass, for example, offers a window into the tumult of the 19th century through Douglass's exemplary life. The early Douglass could not have imagined the end of slavery, and yet by the time his heart quit on him, he found himself struggling against those he called, quote unquote, the apostles of forgetfulness. These were individuals, the country really, intent on scrubbing from view the ongoing consequence of slavery and its aftermath. Attending to Douglass's life and all of its complexities reveals, at least to me, the tragic character of American democracy. The reader sees clearly, as Douglass himself saw, the choice that is repeatedly made in this country because it is repeatedly confronted to cling to the illusion that America is and will always be a divinely sanctioned white nation. That choice limits compassion and erodes the ground for genuine mutual regard. It distorts the character of those who cleave to the belief and sets in the heart of this democratic experiment a corrosive hypocrisy that disfigures the soul of the nation. That illusion, whether consciously held or not, and the evidence is undeniable here, has destroyed and continues to destroy millions of lives. The ongoing evasions, the refusal to acknowledge the wrongs done here and abroad, the safety found in the illusion of righteousness, and the sacrality of the idea of the nation itself result in a kind of mangled virtue that reaches across generations. To put the point bluntly, the country, and I mean not just the South, by the way, the country is haunted by the choices of its white ghosts that tragically and continuously move us about, whether we know it or not. Although these days, it would be hard not to know it. So it is in this context that I reach for Walt Whitman's 1871 book, Democratic Vistas, the searing treatment of American democratic life made up of two essays published in 1867 and 1868 in Galaxy, a short-run mid-19th century monthly magazine, and of course a rejected essay entitled Orbic Literature. This is a book in the shadow of the carnage of the Civil War and the unbridled greed that threatened to swallow the nation whole. Listen to Whitman, quote, "In business, this all-devouring modern word, business, the one sole subject is by any means pecuniary gain. The magician's serpent in the fable ate up all the other serpents, and money-making is our magician's serpent, remaining today sole master of the field," end quote. He would go on to say, quote, "We have frequently printed the word democracy, yet I cannot too often repeat that it is a word that the real gist of which still sleeps, quite unawakened, notwithstanding the resonance and the many angry tempests out of which its syllables have come from pen or tongue. It is a great word, whose history, I suppose, remains unwritten, because that history has yet to be enacted," end quote. Whitman, for me at least, offers an unflinching criticism of the nation, of its culture, its idea of individuals, and its lack of a national literature. And in doing so, as my colleague Jeffrey Stout puts it, he, quote, "articulates the substance of democratic commitments in a way that would allow such commitments to be held self-consciously and self-critically," end quote. Whitman pined for an overarching narrative that went beyond mere liberal proceduralism, something more fundamental that transcended, or better, transformed the mundane into a more religious quality was needed if the nation was to be otherwise, he seemed to suggest. He yearned for a kind of consensus rooted in a spiritualized democratic individuality that bound one to the other. But the country fell short. Out of the ashes of the Civil War emerged a nation bustling with the energy of commerce, quote, endowed with a vast and more appointed body, end quote, he wrote, but with little or no soul, he said. For Whitman, it was not enough that the country be held together by a new politics. Instead, original poets were needed, persons who would mount, quote, the horizon like planets, stars of the first magnitude, end quote, and give, quote, more compaction and more identity to these states, end quote. They, heroic in perhaps Thomas Carlyle's sense of the word, would address the hollowness of the heart of the nation. So I turn to Whitman's apocalyptic fervor in these dark times of our own, to his condemnation of avarice, his horror over the fraying fabric of the nation, his call for a different kind of individuality, one rooted in an understanding of self-reliance that involves at its best an attentiveness to the quality of others' lives, to secure the conditions for our fellows' flourishing as a feature of our own, and to those poets who would give us a literature that speak to the common people, quote, the lifeblood of democracy, end quote, and who would guide us down a different path to a more excellent way of being in the world. In passages like this one, I found, at least for a brief moment, refuge. Quote, a nation like ours, in a sort of geological formation state, trying continually new experiment, choosing new delegations, is not served by the best men only, but sometimes more by those that provoke it, by the combats they arouse. Thus national rage and fury, discussion, etc., better than content. Thus also the warning signals, invaluable for after times, end quote. The manic pursuit of money emptied out the spirit of the country and distorted what sort of people we could reasonably aspire to be, Whitman insisted. Provocative men and women would disrupt the comfort of the robber barons who benefited from such a spiritless state and call attention to the serpent that ate up all others. I like this image, the serpent. It reminds me of a time as a child on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, sitting on cobalt blue shag carpet in our so-called TV room, watching the Ten Commandments and the priests of Pharaoh throwing down their staffs, which turned into serpents. Moses did the same, only his, to the astonishment of Pharaoh, swallowed whole the others. Now, looking back, the CGI wasn't very good, but for a country boy from Mississippi, I was amazed by God's power. There is something ironic, however, not just in my gullibility, but there's something ironic in Whitman's description of greed as the magician's serpent. For there seems to be another lurking in the background, one that stands outsized, dark and ominous, and threatens to overwhelm everything, despite Whitman's profound insistence on the spirit of democratic culture and the power of democratic individuality. Whitman's views about race are pretty well known. Although there are soaring moments in his poetry that aspire for a broad egalitarian society, his journalism and letters are filled with noxious views about Black people. He didn't think much of us. In the Brooklyn Daily Times, for example, in 1848, he wrote in support of the exclusion of Black people from Oregon, quote, "It will be a conflict between the totality of white labor on the one side, and on the other, the interference and competition of Black labor, or of bringing in colored persons on any terms. Who believes that white and Black can ever amalgamate in America? Who wishes it to happen? Nature has set an impossible seal against it. Besides, it's not America for the whites. And is it not better so?" End quote. Even after the abolition of slavery and the war, Whitman expressed his opposition to allowing Black men the right to vote. Ironically, he would have drawn the ire of Douglas, yes? In 1874, sounding a lot like Thomas Carlyle, just 3 years after the publication of Democratic Vistas, in an article entitled A Hint to Preachers and Authors, he wrote, quote, "As if we had not strained the voting and digestive caliber of American democracy to the utmost for the last 50 years with the millions of ignorant foreigners, we have now infused a powerful percentage of Blacks with about as much intellect and caliber in the mass as so many baboons," end quote. Now, the point here isn't the obvious and rather banal claim that Walt Whitman was a racist. That much is clearly true. All too often, such a claim calls forth immediately the equally boring and strained response, mostly from those who may feel a twinge of guilt, that Whitman was, after all, a man of his times. Well, that seems to me on its face a clear example of stating the obvious as if it was profound. We are all persons of our times, and I could marshal a number of examples of people in Whitman's time who did not hold his views. Even Ralph Waldo Emerson was a bit better on this subject than him. But the point here is not about Whitman's racism and the harsh judgment to banish him because of it. No fodder for the anti-politically correct brigade can be found here. Instead, I want to read Whitman's white imperialist self and ideology, his racial lapse, as an indication of the lapse of a certain radical democratic imagining. That the failure to interrogate the looming presence of race and its effects on our character, which George Hutchinson describes as, quote, the complex, productive, and often ironic or scandalous interrelations between ostensibly separate racial cultural traditions in the United States, end quote, actually blocks the way to a more robust and egalitarian vision of American democracy itself. Whitman's choice to be a certain kind of white man haunts his radical democratic vision. In Erasing Race, the lost Black presence in Whitman's manuscript, Ed Folsom has demonstrated in dizzying fashion, I must admit, the extent of Whitman's literary engagement with race and how we might read him. What we see is Whitman's ongoing practice of redaction, how race motivates him in places in his notebooks and in his poetry. Think about the early versions of Lucifer and the Sleepers, and how he systematically renders that influence invisible. By the time we get to Democratic Vistas, race is effectively erased. It has been swallowed whole. Not by greed, however. Instead, by his commitment to what I've called elsewhere the value gap, that is, the belief that white people matter more than others. The irony is glaring, yes? In Democratic Vistas, Whitman aims to show us, among other things, the relation of character in society, how each affects the other, but he fails to be the kind of person his view of democracy demands, precisely because he sees himself, until the day he takes his last breath, as a white man. That perception, or better choice, gets in the way of his embrace of democratic virtue. It limits his capacity for generosity, his sense of humility, and his idea of benevolence and mutuality. In short, it limits his view of justice. As I reach for Whitman in these troubling times with the nonsense of the last 4 years and the clear dangers we face now, I'm also confronted with the demand for a different kind of reading practice. How do I draw on Whitman as a resource? How do I possess him as my own when I see clearly the ways his account of the shortcomings of democracy and its remedy in Democratic Vistas succumb in his living to the tragic reality of race in this country, a reality that suffocates democracy like a python wrapped around its prey? This reading practice, with an aim of possessing the figure as one's own, reminds me of a startling moment in James Baldwin's No Name in the Street. Baldwin struggles with the demands of Western history, that we accept its epic stories and heroes. But this demand reflects the reality of domination, the asymmetrical relations of power that make it such that some have never had the opportunity to reject the history stuffed down their throats like Gerber's baby food. Baldwin wrote, quote, "One might see that the history, which is now indivisible from oneself, has been full of errors and excesses. But this is not the same as seeing that for millions of people, this history oneself has been nothing but an intolerable yoke, a stinking prison, a shrieking grave. It is not so easy to see that for millions of people, life itself depends on the speediest possible demolition of this history, even if this means the leveling or the destruction of its heirs. And whatever this history may have given to the subjugated is of absolutely no value, since they have never been free to reject it. They will never even be able to assess it until they are free to take from it what they need and to add to history the monumental fact of their presence, end quote. He goes on to say, and this is the point that leads me back to the issue of possessing Whitman as my own, quote, at that point, the cultural pretensions of history, Baldwin writes, are revealed as nothing less than a mask for power. And thus it happens that in order to be rid of Shell and Texaco, Coca-Cola, the Sixth Fleet, and the friendly American soldier whose mission is to protect these investments, one finally throws Balzac and Shakespeare and Faulkner and Camus out with them. Later, of course, one may come back, one may welcome them back, but on one's own terms, end quote. Here, Baldwin insists on confronting the serpent of greed in the full light of the serpent of race. For those Black souls caught under the foot of history, we have no other choice. And that act, one of rejection and acceptance, frees us to return to the archive of the West on different terms. History is complex, that much we know. We cannot pick and choose our history, but we can damn sure pick and choose the people and events that best represent who we take ourselves to be. In the end, who we take ourselves to be, our identities are allied with the moral choice. Baldwin is right. Oftentimes with history, we face a raw power move, as if we have to accept Confederate monuments, Winston Churchill, Woodrow Wilson, or Walt Whitman, because the very fact of history mandates it. Rubbish, I say. I'm reaching for the book, no one else. And if I'm to establish my own relation to the history of this place, think of the opening lines of Emerson's Nature, I will have to do so, if it is to be genuine, on my own damn terms. In fact, it is one of the ways I come to understand the very meaning of the phrase, my own terms. Now, echoing in the background, here is Edward Said's idea of contrapuntal reading. Of course, he refers to comparative reading practices that reveal the inner workings of empire, in which, quote, the intertwined and overlapping histories, in quote, shaping Western literature, the colonial imprint, come into full view. Said insists that as readers, critics, we must be able, quote, to think through and interpret together experiences that are discrepant, each with its own particular agenda and pace of development, end quote. He writes this as a comparativist. I embrace it as someone obsessed with the American project and its ongoing disasters. In either case, what is required is a practice that extends our reading to what was and is forcibly excluded. This is how I read Whitman. Think about one of the motivations spurring the writing of Democratic Vistas. Horace Greeley, founder of the New York Tribune, published in its entirety on August 16, 1867, Thomas Carlyle's Shooting Niagara and After. The essay was written after the passage in Britain of the Reform Act of 1867, which enfranchised urban working class men throughout England and in Wales, and reeks of Carlyle's deep conservatism and his noxious views of race. He laments the deforming effects of universal suffrage and asserts the need for heroic figures in defense of a more noble life, quote, a life not of ease and pleasure, but of noble and sorrowful toil, the reward of it far off, fit only for heroes, end quote. Now, Whitman set out to defend democracy against Carlyle, even though Whitman ends up in a place, especially with his devastating criticism of the hollowness at the heart of democratic life, and his call for a particular kind of poet, he ends up in a place that sounds a lot like Carlyle. But Whitman is clear in his defense of the potential power of democracy, democratic individuality in the United States. Quote, of all the dangers to a nation as things exist in our day, there can be no greater one than having certain portions of the people set off from the rest by a line drawn, they not privileged as others, but degraded, humiliated, made of no account. Much quackery teems, of course, even on democracy's side, yet does not really affect the orbit quality of the matter. To work in, if we may so term it, and justify God as divine aggregate, the people, this, I say, is what democracy is for. And this is what our America means and is doing, may I not say, has done. The divine aggregate, that's an end quote, the divine aggregate, the people, with no lines of demarcation, is America's lesson to Europe, according to Whitman. Moreover, political democracy as it exists here, quote, supplies a training school for making first-class men, end quote. This is a direct rejection of Carlyle's vision, where, quote, that of commanding and obeying, where there is nothing more, is not the basis of all human culture, ought not ought all to have it, and how many ever do, end quote. But if Carlyle was a partial inspiration for democratic vistas, and Whitman felt compelled to respond with a robust defense of the potential of democratic life, he felt no need to address one of the underpinnings of Carlyle's essay. Excuse my language here, but I have to use it. Quote unquote niggers are everywhere in the beginning of Carlyle's piece. Servantship, quote, like all solid contracts between men, must become a contract of permanency, Carlyle writes. Not easy to dissolve, but difficult extremely, a contract for life. If you manage it, will evidently be the best of all. And this was already the niggers' essential position. Mischief, irregularities, injustices did probably abound between, quote unquote, nigra and buckra. But the poisonous taproot of all mischief and impossibility of fairness, humanity, or well-doing in the contract never had been there, end quote. Carlyle goes on to write, to me, individually, the N-word, I can't say it anymore, the N-word's case was not the most pressing in the world, but among the least so. America, however, had got into swarmery, he put it, upon it, and felt that in the heavens or the earth, there was nothing so godlike or incomparably pressing to be done. 500,000 of excellent white men full of gifts and faculty have torn and slashed one another into horrid death in a temporary humor which will leave centuries of remembrance fierce enough, and 3 million absurd blacks, men and brothers of a sort, are completely, quote unquote, emancipated, launched into the career of improvement, likely to be improved off the face of the earth in a generation or two, end quote. Of course, what Carlyle says here isn't shocking. We see this kind of thinking in his 1849 essay, An Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, and its slightly amended pamphlet version published in 1853, An Occasional Discourse on the N-word Question. For him, slavery was a form of order and kept an otherwise lazy and feckless people working who for some reason preferred to eat pumpkin instead of work. I'm trying to get to a close here. I'm worried about my time. Whitman completely evades this aspect of Carlyle's essay in Democratic Vistas, as if the question of slavery and the status of Black people in the United States was resolved by the Secession War and the subsequent defeat of the South. Or as if Carlyle's point did not warrant a response, because if his journalism is any indication, he agreed with or was at least discomfited by not so much his defense of slavery, but with the gist of his account of Black people. In fact, the question of race in any substantive sense is wholly absent in the book from Whitman's imagining of spiritual democracy and the importance of character to it, absent in his invocation of self-reliance and his prayer for a cultural practice and literature that reflect the uniqueness of America as such. Blackness is erased. I'm going to skip a lot of this. It is not enough to illustrate. When we read against the backdrop of his journalism and letters, of his journalism and letters, this absence, erasure, demands a different kind of reading practice. I want to track and trace what has been done with him by those poets in Whitman's and Emerson's sense of the word who refuse to silence race and who acknowledge all at once both serpents in full glare of the light. Read towards them and back again, for they confront without flinching the tragedy of race in this country and how it disfigures our souls and blocks the way to the ethical demand to be attentive to the quality of others' lives in our very effort to be more self-reliant. In doing so, I confront the tragic choice that festers and distorts It is not enough to illustrate that Whitman shows up as a favorite poet of, say, Sojourner Truth or of Langston Hughes or James Weldon Johnson. Much more is required. I want to see how Whitman is deployed in the very reconstruction of the idea of democracy itself, how he is in some ways turned on himself in a moment of reflection about character and society. It is here that I turn to a somewhat unexpected place. James Baldwin's 1972 book, No Name in the Street. And I only have 4 minutes, but I'm gonna try. We do know that Baldwin read Whitman carefully. For example, during his time in Shanks Village, a writer's colony near Woodstock, New York, in July and August of 1948, he found in Whitman a resource to think about the complexities of his own identity. Like Whitman, he saw himself as expansive, containing the multitudes. David Lemming puts it best. Baldwin, quote, preferred to think of himself as containing all roles, classes, ethnic groups, and orientations. It was necessary to accept the paradox of himself before he could be, quote unquote, free. The epigraph of Giovanni's Room comes from Whitman's section 33 of Song of Myself, quote, I am the man, I suffered, I was there. And I think this insight can be extended across the body of Baldwin's work. Whitman shows up in No Name in the Street. No Name is a dark and grieving book, fragile and delicate like old lace. It emerges after a period of silence and sickness and, of course, death. Baldwin had witnessed, he was there, the deaths of Medgar Evers and Malcolm X and Martin King. He writes, quote, since Martin's death in Memphis and that tremendous day in Atlanta, something has altered in me. Something has gone away, perhaps even more than death itself. The manner of his death has forced me into a judgment concerning human life and human beings, which I have always been reluctant to make. Incontestably, alas, most people are not in action worth very much. And yet every human being is an unprecedented miracle. One tries to treat them as the miracles they are while trying to protect oneself against the disasters they've become. For Baldwin, the assassinations reveal the depth of the sickness that infects the American soul. And he struggles throughout the book to come to terms with the significance of that conclusion and its meaning for who he takes himself to be and how that in turn shapes his view of the country. His was no longer a prophecy of what was possible if white America failed to do what was required. Think of the ending of The Fire Next Time. Instead, it was a realization of what was in fact reality, namely the disaster of white America's ongoing failure, its choice and the inevitable judgment to come. Like Whitman, who writes in the shadows of the carnage of the Civil War, Baldwin writes No Name in the quote unquote after times of the Civil Rights Movement. He struggles to remember dates and events, priming the reader to be skeptical of his memory. Quote, much has been blotted out, coming back only lately in bewildering and untrustworthy flashes, he writes. Time fractures at a dizzying pace here as the possibilities of the movement give way to the backlash, as the apostles of forgetfulness return with the vengeance to reassert the value gap in the face of demands for a more genuine democratic life. White America, tragically, once again, turned its back on the vision of democracy Whitman extolled. Please bear with me. I have a few more pages. I'm sorry. Baldwin looks back and laments as he tries to remember, quote, it was longer ago than time can reckon, or in one of the darker moments in the book, he writes, in this place, quote, and more particularly in this time, generations appear to flower, flourish, and wither with the speed of light. I don't think that is merely the inevitable reflection of middle age. I suspect that there really has been some radical alteration in the structure, the nature of time. One may say that there are no clear images. Everything seems superimposed on and at war with something else, end quote. With a gesture to Whitman, he cries out, quote, there are no clear vistas. The road that seems to pull one forward into the future is also pulling one backward into the past. There we see this place, this country more clearly for what it is. The carnage comes into full view as well as the evasion, that refusal to grapple with the moral question of what we really want out of life for ourselves and what we think is real. Almost 100 years earlier, Whitman wrote of the unwritten history of the word democracy because it had yet to be enacted. In No Name, Baldwin brazenly declares, echoing Whitman, quote, there are no American people yet, end quote. As such, the appeals and petitions of Black folk fell on barren soil because a different way of being in the world, one not disfigured by the nastiness of white folk, had yet to be born. Whitman in Baldwin's hands is transformed. He doesn't cower in the face of the tragedy of race, seeking to obliterate its traces from the lines in the poem or the book. Baldwin, with his hands around the scruff of Whitman's neck, faces the serpent head on and imagines us anew. It's almost, at least it feels this way to me, as if Baldwin couldn't resist a direct reference to Whitman as he recounts the three white men who looked upon him with such disdain and disgust as he stepped off the plane in Montgomery to meet Martin Luther King Jr. Baldwin writes in No Name, quote, "I had never in all my life seen such a concentrated, malevolent poverty of spirit," end quote. He then narrates the history of the moment and anticipates the revolutionaries to come, and addressing his readers, he writes, "Oh, pioneers, I got into the car," end quote. Whitman's Pioneers, Oh, Pioneers was written in 1865. I don't want to read the poem, you get it. You can read it for yourself. Baldwin, as we read his account of the abject failure of the country, makes us the pioneers. We, the readers are the ones to risk everything to transform the West, just as he shifts the white man's burden to the shoulders of Black people in the epigraph to Down at the Cross. Baldwin expresses with this brief gesture the hope that those who read No Name in the Street would become the ones to sacrifice and to exhibit the courage to step forward and build a new world. But he understood the enormous obstacles to achieving our country. White America, in the generality, had developed over so many generations a number of ritual practices and a lattice work of symbols to avoid confronting the consequences of their choice, from willful ignorance to feigned ignorance, from viewing equality as a charitable enterprise to a callous disregard for suffering, or simply blaming others for their circumstances in the name of self-reliance. Americans have become quite adept at avoiding the question of character when it comes to the pressing issue of race and how it impinges on the answer of who do we take ourselves to be. Baldwin writes, white America remains, quote, unable to believe that Black America's grievances are real. They are unable to believe this because they cannot face what this fact says about themselves and this country, end quote. It is a refusal to confront the reality of what makes this country what it is. And that refusal, along with the evasions, enabled a repeated choice to believe the illusion that this is a white nation in the vein of old Europe, and to engage in the violence that comes when that vision of the country is threatened. Democratic virtues tossed to the wind, because in the end, we aren't the kinds of people to cherish them. Trumpism is just its latest tragic iteration. Like Whitman, Baldwin understood that America's greatness rests with its willingness, I'm coming to a close, to finally embrace who and what it is. Unlike Whitman, for Baldwin, that embrace required a reckoning with the dark history of this country. It required poets, quote, since they must excavate and recreate history. Unless this happens, ours will be an ongoing disaster disguised as the triumph of democracy achieved. Baldwin wrote in No Name in the Street, quote, to be an Afro-American or an American Black is to be in the situation intolerably exaggerated of all those who have ever found themselves part of a civilization which they could in no wise honorably defend, which they were compelled indeed endlessly to attack and condemn, and who yet spoke out of the most passionate love, hoping to make the kingdom new, to make it honorable and worthy of life, end quote. This is what we must do as we confront the moral callousness of Donald Trump in his last days, as we confront his lies that undermine the public trust, his stoking of fears and resentments that embolden those who find comfort in their embrace of whiteness, his policies that line the pockets of modern robber barons and tear open the fabric of the nation that connects us to one another. We are compelled, even as we stand in the rubble of our democratic life, to endlessly condemn and attack at the pitch of passion. As Jimmy wrote in Just Above My Head, not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. If one refuses abdication, then one begins again. It is with this insight and instruction that I return to Whitman. I reach for him in this moment of crisis where the serpent of greed and the serpent of race threatened to swallow us whole, because he understood that we must muster the spiritual wherewithal to fight, quote, on behalf of democracy before democracy gives way. But I reach for him on my own damn terms. And in doing so, as Baldwin shows us, he may be of some use after all in building a better world. Thank you very much. And I apologize for going over time.
No need to apologize. I think we could have all sat and listened to your words for another hour. And you're right on time. Thank you for that just enthralling lecture. I feel like we need to sit a while and absorb it, but we don't have time for that. I want to make sure that we can have a discussion. And we do have a question from the audience, but let me take my moderator's prerogative. And I have so many thoughts about what you said, and it intertwines so much with things I've been working on having to do with the very concept of race and how it blocks imagination. I thought it was so interesting that you used that concept of blocking the imaginary, blocking the imagination. So you pointed out that although Whitman had these noble ideas about democracy and capitalism, I may be misinterpreting serpent, but it sounded to me like the serpent of capitalism. His imagination of democracy was thwarted by his racism, and race limited his view of justice, as you said, suffocated his view of democracy. I thought it was interesting that you had a quote from Whitman that sounded just like a quote from Thomas Jefferson, where Jefferson says, the reason why we can't emancipate Black people is because of the differences nature made. And I wondered if this may be going a little bit off your lecture, but since I know that you're a frequent contributor to MSNBC on current politics, and you mentioned Donald Trump at the end and what we must do, I wondered if you'd say a little bit more about, how Jefferson, followed by Whitman, now followed by the politicians and poets of today that aren't able to really imagine a full democracy because of racism, despite their really brilliant ideas about equality, but it's limited profoundly by racism. So I wonder if you'd say something more about, in today's politics, how progressive movements can be limited by racism.
Absolutely.
What do you have a word about that? Because I think we're all working now, well, progressive, liberal, many ways in which white people's imagination of democracy continues to be limited by their notions of race, their devaluation of people who aren't white, and their inability to see our common humanity.
Right. So, I think, thank you so much for the question. So I think it's really important to understand that Whitman is writing at a moment in which he sees capital snuffing out the life of American democracy. He sees the moral bankruptcy of the Gilded Age. And so the serpent of greed is overrunning the values of a spiritual democracy in his view. But he doesn't really understand, that's the generous read, right? His noxious views of race blind him to the fact that American racism distorts and disfigures democracy. So he can't even become the kind of person his conception of democracy requires. Just like Lincoln can't become the kind of person his idea of democracy requires, or Jefferson, because they hold this view that white people ought to matter more than others. And they hold that view in such a way that they want society to reflect that valuation. So here we are today in this moment where race continues to confound the polity, right? Where an idea of whiteness continues to overdetermine our conception of the good, continues to disrupt a notion of a robust conception of the public good. And we find progressives, some who call themselves progressives, I don't know what these categories mean anymore,
right.
who want to decry identity politics, that this takes us far afield, or they engage in a kind of reductive analysis as if class realities are the only way to account for our current circumstance. And, you know, I was on a panel just yesterday with Governor John Kasich, and the Lord held my tongue. I just want to let you know. And Kasich was talking about working class white folk in the Rust Belt catching hell, not knowing how to make ends meet, and that there were possibilities for cross-racial conversations based on a common condition. And I was like, yes, but there's a history of this kind of commonality of condition, right? So there's the moment, and give you a quick, I'll shut up after this. The moment in which Whitman is decrying the admission of Black people into Oregon, he's doing so as a free soiler. And remember, in Black Reconstruction in Du Bois is writing about how free soilers can't connect their claims with the issue of abolition and slavery, and how this is a kind of preface to how he's reading the inability of a certain kind of class solidarity across racial lines. And so there is this evasion, and Baldwin wants to insist that we evade it because we don't want to admit who we actually are.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah. Well, certainly some very serious and profound implications for the situation we find ourselves in today.
Indeed.
So let me turn to some questions from the audience. One question is, can racism and patriotism coexist in the same space when some self-proclaimed patriots haven't been recognized for their racism? I wonder if that means or haven't recognized their own racism. Maybe it's both. Maybe.
Well, you know, I want to say that, of course, they can coexist in very clear ways. It can take the form of neo-fascism. It could take a number of different forms. And I think we need to be as skeptical of patriotism as we are of racism, right? Baldwin, that quote at the end of my lecture from No Name in the Street, when Baldwin insists that those of us who come out of this tradition, who feel compelled to critique the country, we do so out of love, hoping to make the kingdom new. But I don't read that as patriotism, right? Because patriotism, to my mind, is a form of idolatry. And so we want to be able to lift up I have a deep affinity to this country because this is where my great-grandma was buried. I have a connection to this place because, as Ella Baker used to ask of folk when she was losing her memory, who your people? And the answer to that question is tethered to this place, but that doesn't evidence itself in a form of patriotic love that leads to an uncritical embrace.
Yeah, really interesting. You have to understand what patriotism means, and that was very helpful. And distinguish it from the affinity you were talking about. Right. Yeah. Okay, so here's another question. And I think, well, let's see how deep we get into it, and then we'll see if we have time for more.
Okay, so I'll be quick.
It's okay. Your answers are wonderful. But books are a refuge. Books are refuge and stress-inducing. How do you reconcile the sense of refuge and the sense of anxiety that comes from reading white men and women who erase Blackness? And to what extent do these authors prepare young people for a kind of liberation, if at all? Yeah, I was thinking the same thing as you're talking about Whitman, and then you had this shift. First you're talking to sort of praising him, then you got the shift when you recognize his racism. But you said at the end, how can we still use him? And I take this question as getting at that. What do you do about the, maybe we can use him, but what about the anxiety of the fact that reading him, you're also reading his racism and his devaluation of you? So what?
Well, the main thing, Professor Roberts, is that I came, at Morehouse, I cut my political teeth on the black nationalist tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So I had this moment where I just rejected all of this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm going to read Sheikh Anta Diop. I'm going to be reading Dr. Ben. I'm reading George, Stolen Legacy, and
Right.
and then going into the Pan-African tradition. So that moment in Baldwin's No Name in the Street, where he says that history, we have to accept it because history mandates it. And those of us who haven't had a chance to reject it, we can't come back to it on our own terms. So I don't come to Whitman, without a set of questions and resources, right? What I've been trying to do is I've been thinking about American democracy is to mine this tradition of folks who have thought carefully, even though they're wrong in places, right, about democracy. As I try to find resources to articulate a conception of democracy rooted in the tradition out of which I come. Yeah. And so I don't come to Whitman not knowing that this stuff is there. So I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
But how do I read him? This is like Toni Morrison in Playing in the Dark, right? How does she read American literature? And this is why I invoked Said, right? How do you engage in a contrapuntal reading? So I'm never just kind of, every now and then I might fling the book across the room and pour myself a nice, Jameson. But I'm going to go pick it up again because I have a project that I'm working on, So it's how do we equip ourselves to read these people on our own terms? That's not anxiety inducing because there's a project motivating our engagement with them.
Yeah. Good advice. Okay, now here's a question. I think this comes out of what you said about patriotism. So. Okay. I think the question has to do with, were you just talking about patriotism with respect to the United States? Because the question is, do you identify as a patriot of the Black liberation movement? So I guess it's a question both about patriotism and the connection between what you were talking about and Black liberation. It's a complex question.
Yeah, look, if you think of patriotism as a love of country, right, then I could understand the question in this way. I'm gonna engage in that Quinean move of explication by elimination. I don't love countries. I love people. I love human beings, and I'm a lover of Black people, and that love is expansive, and it's the motivation that drives how I work. So I'm not a patriot of the Black liberation movement. I'm just a lover of Black people. And from that love, as Vincent Harding would say, from that love, I know how to love others.
Well, okay, there's time. So now this was like a follow-up question. Oh, a follow-up question from the question about how to reconcile refuge and anxiety. And this is going to be the last. This is going to be the last question. Is Whitman a failed communicator because of his inability to see the common humanity of Black folk?
I wouldn't say he's a failed communicator. Right. His blind spots are clearly in view. In fact, he communicates very clearly what he believes.
I think this person is wrestling with Whitman like you are, and maybe maybe he will get in touch with you, because I feel like this is a back and forth dialogue, but you gave us so much insight about how to approach someone like Whitman that I think is very, very useful.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I am going to close the session. Again, your lecture was magnificent. I have all these little notes I have. I could ask you many more questions, and maybe I'll have an opportunity to do that uh, in the future. But I was very inspired, and I'm sure everyone listening was, and I will continue to ponder what you said for a long, long time. Congratulations on your book, Begin Again, its success, and thank you for that, your continuing contributions to our struggle and our understanding of what it means to be human, and
Appreciate you.
democracy and freedom mean. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and stay safe.
You too.